Hi, folks. We'd like to welcome you this morning to our presentation on understanding barrier crimes, the screening process and employment. Melinda Roberts from the department is going to do what I think to be the hard work. And when she's finished, I'm going to talk about clinical screening for the barrier crimes. So Melinda, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. So you should be able to see the presentation that I'm getting ready to go through, the PowerPoint, and any forms or information that I'm talking about. If anyone needs a copy or would like a copy, please just let me know, and I'll be glad to get you a copy. So this is just it's a overall view of understanding the barrier crimes as well as the screening process. In order to be a screener, you really need to know what the whole thing is about. Also, my unit is made up of myself plus 2 other individuals, including my manager. We have a part-time person that works 30 hours a week that keys all of our information out to the private providers. Then Stacy Pendleton is the manager of the unit. So this is the contact information. If you have any questions, you can just reach out that way. The code sections that are covered the barrier crimes are 37.2-506, which is for the community services boards. And I know it's kind of small, you can't see it, but I just wanted to give it to you for a reference. It's strictly just saying any CSB that's licensed by the department will have to submit criminal background checks to the FBI on all of their direct care and supervisors of direct care individuals. It also gives the code section for the barrier crimes that govern whether you're able to work for the CSB. Also, 37.2-416 is the code section that covers the licensed private providers. The code is the same and the barriers are the same. Things that you should remember as a CSB or a provider, and what we ask everyone to make sure of, you need to make sure that any kind of criminal history background question on your application matches whatever your disclosure statement has, which is a disclosure statement is required by the licensing and also the code. Also make sure that in your policies that you reference falsification of documentation as it relates to the criminal background check policy, as it relates to the code section. If the criminal record is returned and there is no barrier convictions on the record, you still need to check that against the individual's disclosure statement. Your criminal background check policy at a minimum should be in compliance with licensing regulations. Now, there are 176 barrier crimes, and only 3 of those barriers come with any type of a time frame that are not within the screenable scope, which we'll get at in just a few minutes. But felony possession of drugs is one of the ones that has a time frame, and that is a 5-year time frame. So it's 5 years from the date of your application to the date of your conviction. So whatever date you were convicted, it would have to be 5 years from that date to when in which you were completing the application or the individual completed the application. As well as another caveat to that, if the individual meets that 5 years as far as the conviction date versus the date of the application, they cannot have been on probation or parole for less than 5 years as well. So for an example, because people tend to not understand that piece of it, but let's just say, for example, in January 22nd, 2015, you were convicted of possession of drugs. Well, you applied for the position on January 23rd, 2021. You have met that 5 years, but if the judge, you were given 3 years of probation after the conviction date, then it would not be that January 22nd, 2015 that you would start the time clock ticking. It would be whatever date you were discharged from probation plus 5 years. So it takes it's still a lot of unfairness and bias, I believe, because that 5 year from the probation date gets a lot of people that could very well be a qualified individual that could assist a whole lot of people. So then you have the assault and battery misdemeanor, which is 10 years. So you have the assault and battery, or you have assault and battery of a family member, both of which are 10 years. However, you can only have been convicted of one. So you have assault and battery misdemeanor in 1990. That's way over the 10 years. But then in 2002, you were convicted of assaulting a family member, and or if it was just regular assault, that's still over 10 years. However, it's more than one. So you would not be eligible to be able to work anywhere that's licensed by Department of Behavioral Health. Then, technical difficulty. There we go. So those are the three that come with just general. There's no other kind of criteria that has to be met as far as the barrier crimes. Now, a lot of folks like to, they say, well, what does screenable mean? So if an individual is seeking employment at a CSB, adult mental health or adult substance abuse treatment program, and or somewhere that is an organization, private organization that's licensed by the Department of Behavioral Health, either entities are covered under the screenable piece of the barrier crime law. So there are certain crimes, actually there are 26 crimes out of that 176 that are considered screenable. These are the 26 crimes. Now, it's very hard to read, but they are typically all of your distribution, possession with the intent to distribute drugs. They are burglary, breaking and entering with the intent to commit another misdemeanor, possession of burglar's tools, hazing, just general, those are just some of them. I wish there was a way to get it bigger, but I don't know. I don't want to take up the time to try and do that.
Melinda, this is Joe. It's readable.
Oh, good. Okay.
It's readable.
Oh, good. Okay. So these are the 26 crimes. There are certain criteria that go along with it. And the other piece to this is in the code section, some of the barriers are misdemeanors and felonies. Some are just felonies. So what I did was I took the ones that are misdemeanors, I grouped them all together. So these are what was on that list. Reckless handling of a firearm is it's a misdemeanor, but there's also a felony one as well, or the criteria. So if someone were convicted of the reckless handling of a firearm and it was a felony, or if it was a misdemeanor, then it would be considered a screenable crime. Then you've got the assault and batteries, both for the domestic assault as well as the misdemeanor assault. Then there are others: reckless endangerment by throwing objects, threat, burglary. These are just, now here's the ones that are misdemeanor or felony: breaking and entering a dwelling house, possession of burglar's tools. Then you have any felony violation relating to the distribution of drugs. There are, I can't say I've never, but typically all of your distribution of drugs are going to be felony. But if there is one out there that someone, for whatever reason, the judge reduced it from felony to misdemeanor, then that would not be considered a barrier. So therefore, you wouldn't even need to apply with the screenable piece of the law, because it would not prohibit them from being employed if it was a misdemeanor. Now, there's also one other screenable that did not, the screenable law piece of it, along with the barriers, the screenable barriers, went into effect in July 2001. This particular screenable crime, which is the felony assaulting a police officer, was not at that time one of the screenable crimes. It wasn't until about 10 years ago, an individual who had a substance abuse history and was in recovery, been in recovery for some time. She moved from Florida to take care of her mother here in Virginia. And at the time, she was in the very last part of her nursing, doing nursing internship. When she applied for her internship up in Galax at the Life Center, she found out then that in Virginia, she was not going to be able to work as a nurse, because her passion was psychiatric and substance abuse area because of her prior history. So she was found not eligible. She contacted my office, and I talked to her and explained to her about the law and told her, yes, she was correct, that she would not be able to practice here in Virginia as it stood now. So I told her the only way that any changes could be made would be through contacting her legislator and talking to them in regards to it. So she did. She contacted her legislator. And, excuse me, I'm sorry. I thought I had muted my phone. I apologize. So she contacted her legislator, talked to her legislator. They met. He sponsored a bill that session, upcoming session. It took her 4 years of doing that with the same patron. And on the 4th year, they finally, the committees agreed and voted and put it to where this was going to be added as a screenable crime. There is a difference pertaining to what the criteria is for this person to be screened if they had this conviction on their record, which is they have to have been granted a simple pardon if the offense was a felony and it was committed in Virginia and or in any other state. They would have to have received a pardon from that governor of that state. Otherwise, the other pieces to it, as far as being screenable, would be that this one would there would have had to have been 10 years that elapsed. So the board, the way the screening process would work or start to work would be the CSB and or the licensed private provider would do a screening assessment that the criminal behavior was substantially related to the applicant's substance abuse and that the person has been successfully rehabilitated and is not a risk to individuals receiving services based on their criminal history and his substance abuse history. That is what the screening is based upon. Now, to do that, before the individual would contact the screener, they would need to determine if these criteria would apply. So the individual would have had to have completed all prison or jail terms, is not under any probation or parole supervision, has no pending charges in any locality. And does not mean pending barrier charges. That means any charges at all. That they've paid all fines, restitution, and court costs for any prior convictions. And they have been free of parole or probation for at least 5 years for all convictions, not just barriers, but all convictions. So they would identify the individual based off of their disclosure statement and conversation with the potential applicant or the potential employee. Then they would, of course, have done the background check. And after reviewing the background check, if they identify that someone, the criminal conviction may or may not be eligible for the screening, after which they would sit down and review with the prospective employee by using the applicant screening determination checklist. If applicable, they will complete the checklist, and here is the checklist. It lists all of the screening, the criteria that's associated with the barrier crimes as far as the screening. Once you complete that checklist with them, you're then going to complete a statement to me regarding the date and the nature of the criminal offenses, how the applicant's criminal behavior was substantially related to the use of substances or mental illness. Now, this is what the person is going to establish and write up, and you will provide that with the checklist and send it to me.
Melinda,
They need to talk
this is
about.
Joe. Hey, Melinda, this is Joe. Would you mind going back to slide 19 just for a second?
Okay.
When you referred to this form and you said you will, notice that it says Community Services Board name at the bottom. This information is gathered so that Melinda can do her job. That's the most important thing. Melinda's the one that can verify this information. That's the key. One of the most complicating factors of doing these assessments is what Melinda has to do in terms of the barrier. The clinical side is a little bit easier to do than the background piece and the legal piece of it. But when she says you do this, the Community Services Board or licensed provider who wants to provide it helps gather this information with that person. You don't do it.
Right.
I just wanted to make sure of that, because I don't want to scare people into thinking they have to do this. I have had to help folks pull this information together, and Melinda's office is the one who reviews it and makes the assessment here. And that's the most important thing. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted to make sure.
No, I'm glad. Thank you. I'm forgetting that the majority probably of the audience are individuals that are wanting to be a screener, which we definitely don't want to scare anyone off, because we definitely need screeners.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to make sure that's what it is, because when Melinda did this presentation before to folks at VACSB in a presentation just a couple years ago, it was oriented towards folks in the HR department. So a lot of this information
Yes.
that's provided from HR is not relevant to the screener, which is you, the clinical side, because that's done before you
Yes.
get to it.
Thank
So
you,
that's
Joe.
what's important. Okay, I'm going to
Yes.
sign off now.
Hey,
Thanks.
Joe, we have a question in the chat.
Sure.
They're asking, is this the hiring CSB that completes the questionnaire, or who actually completes this questionnaire?
A hiring CSB.
Okay.
Correct, Melinda?
And or licensed provider. Yes, that is correct. It would be whoever the hiring CSV is, or the licensed private provider would be the ones that would be completing this checklist with the assistance, or rather helping the individual who's wanting to be screened. Okay. So let's see. So we're gonna, based on that, then the individual, along with whoever's assisting at the CSB or the private provider, will help them compile all this information. Once they've compiled all the information, then they will, one of the other main things is making sure that the documentation that 5 years have elapsed since the last conviction of a crime, and that they have had no other criminal charges. Let's see, have I gone, oh, I'm going backwards. I apologize. So and then whoever the CSB is, or whoever the individual is that's assisting the potential screenable person at the CSB or the licensed private provider, will need to make sure they've signed off on the form. Then, of course, whatever cost is involved, the applicant, it will be responsible for that, unless whoever the hiring provider is determines or decides that they're going to assist with the cost of the screening, as well as any costs associated with collection of the needed documentation. Then once everything is pulled together, then they will send everything to me at the department. Once I receive it, then I will review and notify the CSB or the private provider whether the prospective employee is eligible to be assessed and screened. Once I have made that decision, then I will notify the CSB and or provider that they may or they may not, the individual may or may not be eligible for the screening and assessment. If they are deemed eligible for screening, then the CSB will receive a letter along with a list of available screeners, which I hope will, after today, increase more than just 2 people. They'll meet that, then at which time the CSB or private provider will meet with the applicant to provide them with the list of the screeners and any other information that they're going to need. The applicant will then select the screener, and from that point, they will forward all the information that has been collected, along with whatever the payment is, to the screener, or follow whatever directions the screener has for them to follow. The screening contractor is designated by the department. They assess the applicants determined by BIU to have met the screening criteria as to whether they were successfully rehabilitated and not a risk to individuals receiving services based on their criminal history backgrounds and their substance abuse or mental illness history. It's more so, a lot of people, I believe, in the past have shied away, and Joe, you tell me if this is wrong or not, but I believe that one of the reasons why we have not had more than just 2 screeners is, one, people didn't really understand what it all entailed, and also that they were under the misconception that you were, by screening the individual, that you as a clinician were signing off saying that you were guaranteeing that they would never use again, or suffer any type of a mental illness. But that is not what this is. The screening is not determined for that. It's based off of that they will not be as likely to re-offend based off of their criminal history.
It's an interesting, I'll get into a little bit with the definition, but I think sometimes people get confused when it comes to what you're actually doing. It's pretty much what you're doing every day when you're interviewing clients and doing evaluations. You're doing this type of assessment. I'll go into some specifics. I think part of the problem with not having many screeners before was the front end, which is all the legal information that is required, and making sure that clients have all those things laid out. And right now it's a lot simpler working with the department and doing this. I'll talk a little bit about that when I get there.
Okay. So right now, as I said before, we had 2 people on the list and this is the 2 people. They have been our screeners for probably the last 15, 20 years. And Margaret Cook, especially, she's been doing it since the law changed and included the screening piece back in 2001. So I know that she is one of the main person, I believe, that is really hoping that we're able to get more screeners, because she's wanting to retire and enjoy herself. So now this is, I'm gonna go over a little bit about how to become a screener. So as a vendor or screener, if you're interested, there is a request to provide, it's called Request to Provide Criminal Background Screening and Assessment of Persons with a History of Mental Illness and or Substance Abuse. And when you are filling this out, there's supporting documents that we are requesting as well. The process is to document information provided by the vendors seeking to provide pre-employment screening and assessment services for persons seeking employment in the adult mental health and or substance abuse field. The information should be as thorough and detailed as possible for the vendor's approach to providing the screening services. As far as what fees are charged, these assessment fees will be vendor specific or screener specific, meaning that you as the screener will be able to determine what type of fee you're going to charge. The applicants will be responsible for all costs associated with any urine drug screens and additional procedures that need to validate results. Then, as I had said before, the CSB and or the private provider may assist applicants in any and all of the applicant's self-assessment screening determination. Here is the screening form or the application to become a screener. And this is the information that once you complete it, you would submit it to my office, and I will review and verify everything and then turn it over to Joe or whoever the designated clinician person type is to review and make sure everything is complete. And now that ends my stuff, and we'll let Joe continue, unless there are any other questions that anyone has pertaining to what I just went through.
I saw a question in the chat that it says, can an HR director be an approved screener? If the HR person meets the clinical criteria to do that, there'd be no reason to do that, but you won't be doing screenings on people that apply for jobs within your CSB. I view that as a conflict of interest. So
yes, that is correct. So one of the things that I had proposed when we were meeting as trying to decide and figure out a way to get this off the ground and running, and Joe and I have spoke about it on several occasions. Joe does this as a service offered by Chesapeake CSB, but he does not perform any screenings on Chesapeake potential employees. He would do anyone else. So he could do VAC, Virginia Beach CSB person, or, whatever board, or either whatever licensed private provider sent their person, or they chose, picked him, or he was available to do it. So it really would be very beneficial if each one of the CSBs could possibly go along the same lines as what Joe is doing, because that would be 40 screeners or more that we could have as available for individuals that want, that need to be screened.
Right. Melinda, we have a couple other questions in the chat. One question is approximate range of fees. Can you provide information about what reasonable fees to charge? How many hours can the process entail? And should the charge be region specific? My answer to that question is no, 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 and no. I will tell you what we charge. I mean, there's only two of us doing it right now. I charge for our CSB $200 plus the cost of whatever it costs us to do the urine drug screen. So it's about $230 to $250 depending on what we do. So that's what it is. How much time it takes? Let me do my presentation, and we can talk about that a little bit more in detail. The application to become a screener is part of the assessment, and Melinda will send that out as a separate document, so you don't have to try to print out what's in her presentation to do that.
Yeah, yes.
We'll do that. We'll get that squared away. Okay. All right, Melinda, if you want to unshare your screen, I'll share mine and I can get started.
Okay. Okie doke. It says it's unshared.
Okay. All right. Can you see my screen?
No, not yet.
How about now?
No.
Okay, let me figure out why we're not sharing the screen.
There you go. You're good now.
Okay, cool. All right, let's get started. Barrier crimes. I wanted to start out by saying I really appreciate what Melinda's done, because Melinda has made my job easier and will make your job easier. The thing that's the most intimidating piece with doing barrier crime assessment screenings is the legal side. I've spent a lot of time with consumers, people who are interested in doing becoming peers, trying to walk them through the legal stuff. And that's probably the hardest thing, I think, to do. Right now, the clinical stuff is basically things that you've already done. So let me get to my ability to move on here. And of course, I'm having a little technical difficulties. Okay, let's talk about the screening process. The screener's job is fairly simple. It's to help assess applicants determined by Melinda's department if they meet the screening criteria. She mentioned this before, that the primary issue is to show that criminal behavior was substantially linked to the client's substance use or mental illness. And the second part of that is whether or not they're successfully rehabilitated and are not at risk to individuals who are receiving services. We mentioned that before, and we referenced the code there. You can always go back to the code to see how that plays in. I break it down a little bit more for you. So when is a person successfully rehabilitated and not at risk to individuals receiving services? You know, most folks who do clinical assessments are already doing some of this. we're looking at a number of factors to help us understand, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. So what does it mean for somebody to be rehabilitated and not at risk? Well, what I did was I went back to the Oxford Dictionary to see what it meant, because I think it gives us a pretty good definition of what our job is in order to meet these criteria. The first one is has the person been restored to their former privileges or reputation after a period of clinical or official disfavor? That's pretty technical, but we'll get to that in a second. And what does it mean to restore to health or normal life by training and therapy after imprisonment, addiction, or illness? So let's look at the rehabilitated and not at risk first. What does risk mean? Risk means proposing potential harm or danger and refers to how likely one is to experience a certain problem. So to assess rehabilitation and risk, we need to do the three things. I know folks have concerns about being held liable for things. I always say when you do a clinical assessment, you have to do three things. First of all, you have to show that you're comprehensive. You need to look at what a normal practitioner would do to determine the gathering of information and assessment that you need to do. Second, you should have some type of a flow or logical sequence in your assessment, so that if somebody looks at it, they know that you had a rhythm to what you're doing and that you were checking the boxes as you went along. The third thing you have to do is you have to make a logical conclusion and end up being defendable on your assessments. Something, again, that you would do in any clinical assessment. So the first thing we have to look at is, how do you assess restoration of former privileges? These are the things that Melinda already has done for you. When has the applicant been convicted of a barrier crime? If you know when that is, that plays into the time spans that she mentioned on the crimes that were noted in the statute. Have they paid their debt to society? Well, she's already doing that assessment for you, because in order for you to say that the person is eligible to provide these services, you have to ask, have they completed their sentence? Have they paid their fines? Are they off probation? And they have not been under court supervision for an extended period of time, minimum of 5 years, and have no pending trials or recent infractions. Again, these are all things that are checked, the boxes are checked before you get the evaluation, but it's your job to look at them again and make sure they were. One of the questions that I have all the time is, how do I find out this? You're going to find people who come out of the, are in recovery for a long time. They've gone through peer training and they say to you, oh, gee, my crime was 30 years ago. What difference does it make today? Well, you still have to prove all these things. How do you find that information? How have they paid their fines? Have they completed their sentence? Some of these things are related. You're not going to get off of probation unless you're completed your sentence. You're not going to get off of probation until you paid your fines. The minimum of 5 years, Melinda referenced before as a potential problem, may be too long. I don't see it as too long. I think many people who start out in their recovery want to give back. And whenever they want to become peers, sometimes they try to help others before they've really finished helping themselves. So I think the 5 years is a good criteria, but it's something that the law already has assessed in there. So assessing restoration of former privileges or reputation after a period of critical behavior. Again, that sounds pretty lofty, but if you can answer these questions, has a person received a pardon? Have they had a restoration of rights? That helps a lot in terms of you determining whether or not they've addressed the societal burden of what they've done. Have they provided a statement from their most recent parole officer outlining the period of supervision and a copy of any pre-sentence or post-sentencing report in connection with a felony conviction? You need to know that helps you a little bit with the circumstances. If you can get your hands on that, that helps you understand a little bit about what was going on at the time of their offense. So down to the clinical assessment. What does a clinical assessment need to look like? Well, in order to assess the person's behavioral health conditions on the individual's life, you need to look at a lot of things. To me, I think you need to look at as many functional areas as you can. Most clinicians are already doing this type of assessment in their intake evaluation. Nothing is new here. Things that you would assess normally in an intake evaluation or mental health evaluation is the person's emotional and psychological state. What is their current diagnosis? Do they have a current diagnosis? Do you believe they're in remission? Do they meet the remission criteria for the disorder? The things that are more important, I think, or related, I shouldn't say more important, is what is a person's current physical or mental medication status? Do they have any medical problems that would impair their psychological functioning? And that's important to look at because sometimes people are prescribed medications that may have psychoactive effects. So you need to ask those questions. What about relationships? A relationship is a good indicator of where they are in their current recovery status. Do they have good relationships with people? And what do those relationships consist of? Occupation and economic. Are they taking care of their business? A person could be, if they're not taking care of their business, they're not employed, they haven't had some effort of employment, they may not be stable enough to work with other folks. What is their educational level? What are they doing related to their education? Have they already gone through the, if they want to become a peer, have they already gone through the peer training? Have they looked at working in advanced degrees? It's interesting, the other day I got a call from somebody interested in a potential barrier crime that was a social work student at a community college. And he had recently been charged with possession because he had some paraphernalia that had drug residue in it. He said, will that keep me from becoming a social worker? And, I tried to hesitate to give him any advice other than around barrier crimes. I said, it's simple possession is not a screenable. It's a crime that would be a screenable crime. A person could continue to provide services for that. But, is this person ready in their recovery if they're still using? Well, people have ins and outs. So understanding where they are in the educational process is important, especially if they want to become a peer or they want to become a professional. One of the first people that I screened years ago was an individual who was a licensed individual who was working in a correctional setting. And in correctional settings, if you look at the code, the screenable crimes and the barrier crimes aren't included. So in a correctional setting, this person as a licensed provider was able to provide services. But when he stepped into the outpatient setting, he had to be screened. He had a possession charge where possession with the intent to distribute 20 years ago when he was a student in college. That didn't prohibit him from getting his education, didn't prohibit him from, getting into recovery and doing what he needed to do. But he had to cross this line in order to do an assessment in order to provide services in the community. Corrections were not included. Obviously, what's the person's substance use right now? We'll talk a little bit more about that. Are they still using? Are they using legal substances that have potential signs for abuse? What is their current legal status? And what is their spiritual situation so that they may be getting some assistance from and support from their spiritual group? Okay. So the assessment that I complete, and I have 2 copies of them that I'll send out as well to give you a template to do this, includes, but it's not limited to, a mental health and substance abuse history. The substance abuse history should do the things that you're currently doing. If you're a clinician in CSB now, you're looking at with substances, what their age of first use is, the frequency and duration of drug use, the date of last use, and what efforts they've made to stop. If the person has mental health issues, what is their treatment history? What have they done to address the issues that they've had over the lifespan? Also, it's important to do a comprehensive family history as it relates to the person's substance use and mental health treatment. Again, same thing as you're doing now in intake assessments or mental health evaluations. You're taking a look at family history because family influences how you provide, how you are formed, as well as talk a little bit about your support system. So again, it's something that you probably are already doing. One of the things that I like to do in the interview is to make an assessment of the person's overall functioning. How's their functioning changed over time? What types of slips have they had since their barrier crime conviction? Have they had any issues that are related to substances since that time that maybe they've been arrested for and not convicted of? Are they currently using any drugs? I remember one individual who I worked with when they were in their early stages of recovery. They were shunning all substances, whereas when they were in later stages of the recovery from their primary drug of choice, the illegal drug of choice, they were still drinking. Is that an issue? Is that a potential source of harm? That's something you have to explore. How are they functioning today versus how were they functioning back at the time of their barrier crime conviction? Hopefully they're functioning a heck of a lot better. Some factors to consider. Current behavioral health. Has the individual been receiving or experiencing any behavioral health symptoms similar to what was happening then as is happening now? What types of things have they had that caused a significant relapse? And are any of those things going on in their lives now? Asking the question about whether or not they've been hospitalized or sought inpatient or residential treatment since the barrier crime is important. What is the current uses of substances prescribed in others? I've had one individual who came in for an assessment that I did a while back who was still on Suboxone. Well, I think that's a positive thing. That not necessarily a negative thing. People move through their recovery at their own pace. So I didn't see having a person on Suboxone, because it was a minimal dosage and had been tapered over time, that was a problem. Some clinicians may see that as a problem. Should the person be free and clear of all substances? That's an individual clinical decision that needs to be made. Most importantly to me, how are people managing their recovery? Is the person currently in treatment? That can be viewed as a very positive thing if they feel like they still have issues to go on. Especially in the peer community with mental health issues, people often stay in treatment for a long time. It may be a matter of still seeking counseling or providing, being provided medication in order to manage symptoms. What are they doing as part of the recovery community? Is the person still involved with AANA, Smart Recovery, or any other system that may be out there that would assist them in maintaining their sobriety? That's really important. And one of the sneaky things I always ask people to do is tell me what you do in your spare time. I think that's a good indicator. What are your hobbies? What do you do to manage your time? If their time is only focused on the recovery, are they doing other things to build their life besides, as part of the recovery, to help them do the best for the future? Are they managing their lives in a different way? Are they involved in sporting activities? Are they involved in hobbies? Those are important things to look at, because typically a person would have a harder time with recovery from substances if you have your time well managed. What does a support system look like? Again, this is another big one for me. What kind of relationship do they have with family and friends? Is their partner that they're living with currently in recovery? Are they a substance user? Have they used substances? What does their family look like in terms of substances use? Are they doing things that are related to helping them maintain their sobriety, or are they in situations where they are more likely to use or slip because of their family? Do they have close friends or romantic relationships at the time? Again, a partner can make a big difference in their continued sobriety, and also can give you some indication of how they're managing their time and how their outward focus is. I think that's really important. If you can have some person who has a longer term relationship and has some support, they're less likely to have problems if they have the right kind of relationship. talk to folks about their employment history, and that might sound kind of funny, but again, if a person has had, especially for the last 5 years, they've been off probation, if they've had a steady employment history, they're goal focused, and they have a plan for the future, it's really important. As I mentioned before, has the individual had any issues with law enforcement since their original crime? Again, it doesn't have to be related to their substance use or their mental illness, but are they engaging in any illegal activities? Have they been, a good indicator also is whether or not a person has had on their criminal background, if you have access to that, to take a look at what things they were charged with and the things were null pros. Which means they were not didn't go forward with a conviction because there wasn't enough evidence. But if you have a person that's had 3 or 4 assault charges or simple assault or on a family member, or they've had bad check writing, sometimes if they've had a number of things, you have to start questioning whether or not that person is the right person to move on. A biggie for me also is what kind of plans do you have for the future? Most people who have a stable life have some plan for the future. What do you want to do with your life? What are you going to do with your family? How do you see yourself in 5 years? Those are important questions to ask and have answered. Drug and alcohol assessment. I like to do a drug panel, 7 or 9 panel on the day I do the evaluation, and to have an alcohol screening done. Why? I mean, obviously, that gives you a sense of objective indicator whether or not a person has used anything recently. Doesn't mean that they couldn't have stopped for a while, but usually people who have problems with for any reason stopping, they're not going to stop. And to do an evaluation without this is pretty unconscionable. I think it's a good idea to do that. It is a little challenging in the time of COVID to have this done. You have to work with other folks to get this done, especially if they can't come in. But I think it's a good idea to make sure we have an assessment to give you some objective indicators here. The urine test obviously should indicate the drug of choice under which a person committed the crime, for which is screenable. I think that's a very simple thing to say, but you need to take a look at that specifically because, again, most folks who have a history of using one substance often stay with that drug. Okay, so what are the essential components of the clinical screening? The first thing you have to do when you get ready to do a screening is to review all the information the individual has produced for a screenable barrier crime that the department has. You need to take a look to make sure that all folks have completed their jail or prison terms. That's pretty clear if they're out on the street. I don't think they're having to complete a jail term. However, but if they're on probation, they still have time hanging over them. Again, second thing is not to make sure that they have no probation or parole supervision. They have no pending charges in any locality. That's why a criminal background doesn't help you a whole lot there. You basically have to have the person certify that they have no charges in the locality. And what I typically do if I have to do this up front is I ask them to do a notarized statement to the same fact. The same thing happens with fines, restitution, and court costs. If a crime occurred 20 years ago or 25 years ago, a lot of that stuff isn't digitized. So I would have them certify to me and in a notarized statement that they paid all their fines and they've done all the restitution. And that you take a look at the letter that they provided, that they're free from probation and parole for at least 5 years for all convictions. Because as Melinda mentioned before, it may not be the barrier crime that's the problem. Some people have other charges that occurred after that. You have to do a face-to-face screening assessment. And when I wrote this, I said face-to-face. Face-to-face can be video as well. There's no reason why you can't do it on video. You have to, in my opinion, complete a drug and alcohol test, and you have to complete a written report of documented findings. The sample layout of the report is fairly simple. Again, I'm going to go over this. I'm going to show you 2 of them that I did. I like to document in my report what documents were received and reviewed. That comes from doing forensic evaluations before. You need to make sure that people understand how you did the evaluation, what information you used to come to your conclusions. The second thing you need to do is to do a mental status evaluation, which is fairly simple. All of you know how to do that as treating clinicians. Review their systems and make sure that you feel comfortable that you're not seeing any signs of current mental illness, any objective or obvious signs of substance use that you have at that time. You need to get a good treatment history for mental health and substance use disorders to give you some idea how severe the problem is. If the person was in and out of treatment many times or only in and out of treatment once, get some feel for how severe the difficulties were. Many of the folks that I've seen, well, not many of them, some of them have had issues where they were part of a group who did a crime when they're under substance abuse. That's a little bit different than if you're out there doing it on your own. It's also, if you're an individual who has had a long history of dealing drugs, what was the crime that was so large? If you had a number of those crimes before, important to take a look at. What is the recovery status? I'd like to include in the report what the individual is doing currently for their recovery. Are they involved in AA or NA or any other long-term support system? How are they using their family for recovery or friends for recovery? What are their activities that identify things like their hobbies, their spiritual life, their relationships, all of which would help to give you some indication of where they are. And also have the applicant submit to that breathalyzer and urine screen. If you can do a chain of custody, that's great. If you can't, that's okay as well. I know that chain of custody is the best way of doing it. I had our city attorney look at that, and they love to have the chain of custody, but that just isn't practical for what we need to do here. Plus, we're not going to court on this. Okay, I'm going to pull up an assessment here to take a look at. Let me see if I can do this easily. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. Pull up two reports. And I'm sorry for the dead air. I'm having trouble pulling up this report, so just give me a second. While I'm doing that, if you have any questions, you can put them in there and Gabrielle will pop them up so we don't waste your time on this.
There is a quick question, Joe, that says this person's a notary public. Would they be able to certify with her as part of the assessment? Is that not an option?
Absolutely. You just want to have somebody saying that someone else the opportunity to address that. You just want to make sure that they have some. And I also saw a question about assessments being allowed to be conducted by telehealth. Yes, you can. There's no restriction to doing that. I'm sorry, I'm piddling with the with my screen share here.
Somebody else also asked, how many times do you typically meet with the applicant to complete the assessment?
I will tell you what I do that makes it easier for me. Much of the information that's required, I try to send people an email and say, this is what information I need. For example, most of the individuals here are pretty interested in getting an assessment completed. So I'll say, I'll give them a list of information I need. For example, I'll say, here's a list of, give me a list of the medication, the drugs that you've used, and I'll break it down. And I'll show you a copy one here when I share the screen. I ask them to provide historical information. So I don't have to ask them a whole lot of questions. All I have to do is clarify information as opposed to dragging it out of them. Usually I spend about 2 hours with people. That's my typical interview. All right, let me see if I can get this one up now.
And last one real quick, can a CSAC or do they have to be an LPC in order to do the assessment?
Licensed.
Okay.
Yeah, licensed. We did that. Not that CSACs don't have an important role here, but no, because this requires a comprehensive assessment that goes beyond just substance use, we need to do that. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Let me get down here and drag it down a little bit. You can. Again, I apologize for my fumbling. For some reason, I'm having difficulty getting to my screen that I can manipulate it. There it is. So you see what I start out doing is I have the basis of the evaluation, the clinical interview, what documents I reviewed, what standardized instruments I used. The typical mental health assessment, assesses the person's appearance, their physical behavior during the interview, their rate of speech, their thought content, thought processes, orientation, judgment, insight, intellectual ability, affect and mood, that sort of thing. Again, pretty much standard when it comes to the assessment of an individual. History, again, pretty simple stuff. Family marital history, here's an indicator. Father was an alcoholic, mother drank and stopped. Dad had health conditions that stopped him drinking, which also may be an indicator of how bad his drinking was and the circumstances under which he grew up. His relationships with other folks, never married. The fact that he has children suggests he had some indicators of relationships. He still has somebody in his life, which is important, to help. Employment history, again, I didn't make any comments in here, but an individual that I had assessed recently had gone through, was in recovery, finished his bachelor's degree, went on to his master's degree, and was working on licensure while he was a peer. So I took a look at the physical condition. I've had a couple situations where individuals who had physical conditions had medications that were potentially addicting. And we had to address that in the evaluation. I had to have them show me that they revealed that they were using a substance that had potential addicting qualities, that I asked them to get a statement from the physician or to show me that it was a prescribed medication, especially if it comes back on the background. Substance use history, this is pretty much a template that I use. It gives you an indicator of what this person was using. Again, my clinical background isn't in substance abuse alone, but I know that if a person starts early, they tend to have longer usage patterns. Here's a person who was using daily usage up until 1997, started at 14. Again, different ages, started pretty much as drug use as adults. I often have, and I don't have it on this one, but I have it on my newer ones that I do. I have an other, because you don't know what you don't know. Other people may be using things like a person may be huffing. You got to put that down too. Current substance use, had the breathalyzer results, urinalysis results. You can see, excuse me, the treatment history for a person, mental health issues, using drugs, in and out of treatment. And then the criminal history. The last thing I like to do is I like to do a pretty clear summary so that the department will know that I've looked at the things that we needed to look at. I usually try to cite the code section of the exceptions for the barrier crimes. I mean, that's an obvious one, but also what the crimes were that the person was convicted, what the barrier crime was that we're assessing. A statement about their current mental health or substance use disorder and their ability to work effectively. The documentation that I reviewed, I restate it, so there's no question that I looked at the things that the code says. The reason I have the checks there is because those are the things that we're required to check. And then I give what my opinion is. That his criminal behavior was substantially related to the use of the substances for which he was arrested, and he successfully rehabilitated and is not a risk to consumers. You know, that doesn't mean that, again, what we stated before, it does not say that you're making a, you say that the person would not. You say at this time, they're not. So that's where it is. Let me see if I can quickly stop sharing this one and pull up the next one. Let's get the next one. All right. All right, sharing the next screen. Okay, you're able to see that okay?
Yes, we can see that one.
Again, I use the same format. I have the same things at the top that I normally have. Get down to the meeting here on computer. Apologize for the slow nature of my handling of this. Okay, here I have reviewed documents reviewed. I note there's a letter from court services and the offender's supervising agency certifying that all probation and parole was completed. No certification from the client, there was no pending arrest. The certification of the arrest and conviction, and all fines were paid from the circuit court. I listed what the circuit court was. And same mental status evaluation, same issues there. Historical family information. Again, this guy was never married. First generation in the country. He was an immigrant, which when we look at the history, you can see he had some issues. Road to recovery. This is, I think, a good assessment of where this guy is. Recovery started in jail, got tricked into recovery by dodging jail. I love it. So he got going to AA and NA, helped shape his sobriety, started to give back, works in the peer community, strong advocate, had his civil rights restored by the governor. He also published a news article. So his crimes, again, currently no breathalyzer problem with alcohol. Urine test was negative for the 9 panel I gave him. All his criminal background related to his substance use. What his education is, he got a bachelor's degree, associate's degree, he had a certificate in peer recovery. His employment history, the employment history is that's what's relevant to his recovery. You know, this guy obviously was working really hard to try to become move up in his organization, and he had goals for the future. He reviewed his criminal record. Again, this states pretty much the same thing as I did in the last one. I use that template, so people, not a question about where he's going. So, okay, I'm going to stop and share. Go back to my presentation. Share this. Okay, we should be back on the share screen again. Okay, so you saw the last two evaluations. That's pretty much what I'm doing for all evaluations. You know, you can see and we'll make sure you get copies of those if you want to use those as a template. Feel free to add anything you want to them as you need to. Oh, let me do something again. Caught up again. Okay. All right, so that was the second report. I think that should be bringing us pretty much to the end here. So any further questions you all might have? It's okay if you don't have questions today, because I'm going to give you my email address and as well as a phone number if you need to consult with me to call. We'll be doing it. Okay, somebody asked about receiving the presentation materials and templates, and we'll be glad to do that. That's not a problem. So the next step is to, in the application process, is to get the forms from Melinda in her presentation, and we'll go ahead and send those out at the time. Floyd, I can't hear you, so you have to type it in. If you get your rights restored and there is less than 5 years of probation completed, could you be excluded? Absolutely not. The law says 5 years. So that's what we have to do. There is no exclusion to the 5 years. Anything else?
I will say that I do want to say this. I just remember, for those of you that were asking about being able to be excluded and such, and I put this, I tell this to all of any kind of training class that I'm presenting on. Your local legislators have the ability to take away some of these issues and some things that aren't fair. So I just say that to remind everyone that if you have any concerns or feel something is unfair or anything to do with the barrier crimes and the barrier crime laws, you need to reach out to your legislators, because like the instance that the example I used of the woman from Florida, moving from Florida to Virginia, it took her a little while. It's not a quick fix, but it did, she was able to get it changed.
And just to amplify that, one of the individuals that I did an assessment on had worked with his legislator to enter a bill that would make breaking and entering a barrier climb screenable offense. And he was successful, and now is a working peer in a local CSP. Somebody had a really good question here. Is there any review of reports to ensure consistency? We're not at that point yet, but I believe there will be, because one of the things that the office of Mark's office, I can't remember the name of it, the Office of Consumer Affairs at the department, has recommended that we take a look at and have copies of these reports sent to the department. So the department will have essentially a bank of evaluations that at some point in time they can bring folks together and to do a review. So that's an important thing to recognize that we would do. Someone else brought up the issue of the form saying that CSACs and QMHPs can do the evaluations. I don't remember that. I'd have to go back and look, because as a committee, we decided not to do that because we don't want to have people go through 2 different steps of evaluation. But that's the department's judgment. That's not mine. Ideal turnaround time to get information and submit reports. Let me tell you how I've been handling it from a practical standpoint. I don't schedule evaluations with people until I have all the documents in hand. And I've learned that because I've had a couple people who, wanted to schedule appointments for evaluations, and I wasted my time doing the assessment, and they never were able to get the information that was necessary to meet the criteria that are set out. So I was left hanging the bag with wasted time, for one, and two, we didn't get paid. So I don't do them unless I have all the information in hand. I have a person right now I'm waiting on to gather the information necessary. And once I have the information, I'll schedule the appointment and be able to do the evaluation. The other thing is I require, for myself, I require payment at the time I do the evaluation. That's a matter of course, because not that anybody stiffed us. We've only had like 1 or 2 in all the years I've done it, but still we want to do that. In terms of writing up a report and getting it out, if you have all the information that is required, that it's mentioned, and you do a good clinical assessment, you should be able to turn that report around, within about a week to 2 weeks. So I think that's pretty easy. Okay.
Someone asked about internship. If you're doing an internship to complete a degree, if you have to work in the SARMI, will you be denied? So I'm thinking that the question is, being an intern, will you have to go through the background check process? And then, okay, let's just say for that, that is the question. So interns, they are not mandated by the code to have a criminal background check done. However, the regulations for licensing state that the provider or the CSB has to have a policy and procedure on conducting, or on how they are conducting background checks on all individuals, all employees, not just direct care and individuals supervising direct care. When the regulations were written, they were written for, they needed to show what they were, how they were going to handle all their staff. So, and at a minimum, those additional, the other criteria of staff, the non-direct care, the interns, the volunteers, students, at a minimum, they had to have a disclosure statement on file. But if the provider or the CSB write their policies that states anyone that is providing any type of a service or in any type of position with the CSB and or licensed private provider will have to undergo a FBI fingerprint-based search. So if that's how their policy is written, then the answer would be yes, the intern would have to have the background check. Yes, they would be held accountable for if they had any kind of a barrier crime conviction. But if their policy doesn't say that, then that intern would just have to have a disclosure statement on file, and then the provider or the CSB would have to review that disclosure statement and make any notes pertaining to if someone had a barrier crime conviction on that disclosure statement, why would they still be entertaining the internship? And so then the provider would have to offer an explanation and make sure they have it in the file. So I hope I answered that.
And the other thing, somebody asked the question, do you give a copy of the evaluation to the individual? And the answer is yes. The department will get a copy henceforth, and the individual gets a copy because, once they're screened, They don't have to do it again. So, it bodes well for them to keep a copy because sometimes change employers, and it's a way of doing it. The reason we wanted to have a central repository with a department is because ultimately the reason we have, the department is the one who licenses programs. So it would be easier to do that. And Melinda has been gracious to say that they would maintain them. I certainly appreciate that because, everybody, changes positions and leaves, and it's kind of hard to find those documents, maybe in CSBs, depending on how they go. So.
Alethea, you said if you have not already, can you speak having more than one barrier crime? I'm assuming I'm not exactly sure what exactly you're asking.
Let me answer. I think I might be able to answer it. When you do the assessment, you're assessing for all the barrier crimes. So if you have a screenable barrier crime, and then you have a barrier crime that prohibits employment, the barrier crime that prohibits employment trumps it, and you're not able to do it.
Yes, you're right. Yes, that is correct. And in retrospect to that, it should have never gotten to the screening point. You
Right.
shouldn't have, you know, so
Yeah.
if it did,
Yeah.
it got
And
past somebody.
I tell you, in terms of a flow chart, what I'm doing now with my evaluations is if somebody calls me up and says, Joe, would you do an evaluation for me? I'm seeking employment as a peer at Richmond Behavioral Health Authority, say. I will say, here's Melinda's number. Have her give you the blessing to get the screening. Will get me to do the screening. And the reason I do that is because then all the documentation, the legal documentation, has already been gathered, and you don't have to do that. Second, there's a lot of questions that occur with people that make it very difficult to do assessments sometimes. And it's usually the legal stuff that trips you up. It isn't the clinical assessment. All you guys can surely do the clinical assessment with not a problem. But you'll get into stuff that you don't have an answer to. I'll give you an example. One is if you have an individual come from another state, all the codes of criminal justice are not consistent. So what is a barrier crime in North Carolina, being that I'm on the border, I see that, or in New Jersey or New York may not be the same. I've had to pull my hair out to try to help people doing this. And right now, the best thing to do is to have Melinda pull out her hair, not me. So I have somebody who can actually figure that stuff out and let me do what I do best, which is the clinical assessment.
Okay, so Alethea, you said, is it my understanding that if you have two screenable barriers, would that exclude one from being able to proceed with the screening process? No, as long as you don't have any non-screenable barriers, then as long as you meet all the criteria, if you've got, let's just say somebody has been convicted of breaking and entering, and they were also convicted of felony possession of burglar's tools. Well, both of those are barriers, but because there is nothing that says you can only have been convicted of one, such as the misdemeanor assaults, and as long as they meet all of the criteria associated with the screening, then it does not matter how many screenable barriers they've been convicted of.
Yeah, that's true. Somebody had put a question in the question and answer, and I just looked at it. Asked, how do we know if the person has pending charges as the employer? Are we asking the individual if they have pending charges and going with their response? That's a great question. I think the thing is it's 2 points. First of all, if you're charged with a crime, if you're arrested, it's on your criminal record. Yes. So if you had anything recent, it's going to say you're arrested. So, you're pretty, we're asking from the time that they get their criminal background FBI check to the time that they do the assessment. Hopefully that's a short period of time. So you're not asking them to certify anything other than they haven't been arrested. And of course, we're not talking about traffic crimes or anything like that, unless it's, a very severe traffic crime, it shows up, but none of those are barrier crimes.
Also, one other thing, a lot of people get confused, and a lot of people think one way and it's not that way. The way the law is written, it says the individual is hired for compensated employment in a direct care position at a DBHDS licensed organization, private provider, and or community services board. And therefore, they have the individual, which it doesn't make much sense, and to me it's backwards. I've always thought that. But an individual, in order to be screened, they have to have received an offer from the CSB or from the private provider. They can't just go and apply with the provider and or not even apply for the provider, but see that there's a position that they feel they would be qualified to do, but they know that they have this crime, and then they find out that it's a screenable crime. I've had several individuals contact me wanting to know how to have the screening done. Well, whenever I get that question, my very first question I ask is, have you already had your criminal background check done by the CSV or the licensed private provider? Sometimes they will say, no, I just saw this job and I think I'm going to be qualified for it, but I don't know whether whether my conviction is going to be a barrier to my employment. So Joe or whoever, whatever screeners, you can't do a screening until until that person has actually received the job offer.
Right. And what I've done, I had one recently that I'm working on. The individual had been turned down because they didn't have they had a screenable bare crime, and, they had to fill a position. So what I've asked the employer to do, and CSBs can do that, they can do a conditional offer. And if you do a conditional offer, then you have the paperwork necessary to do the screening evaluation. Melinda will permit you to do that. And then you can go ahead with the screening process and help the individual out. And then once they have the screening done, they can use it wherever they need to do it. So that's important to know.
Okay. Angela, you said, why do screeners do a recovery quality assessment if the CSB has already done that and offered the candidate a job? Now, are you meaning that if they were convicted of a screenable crime? Or I'm not exactly sure what you're meaning, recover quality assessment.
I don't know what that is either. The code says that you have to have the evaluation and do these. That's why we do it. If we let it up to the CSBs alone, we could have a lot of folks, I think but we have to follow the code, and the code says you have to have an evaluation. That's why. It's sort of like your mother saying, I do it because I told you so.
Exactly.
I'm sorry, I had to put that out there. Somebody had put a note in the chat asking, can you attach supporting documentation to the reports or just a note? I don't typically attach copies. I have copies. When I was doing all the stuff before I sent them to, my thing is if you get them, you can always attach them as long as you maintain a copy, like the electronic health record. That's what I do. I scan them. There's no reason to send them on to somebody else. I mean, 3 people have looked at it before you got it already anyway. So, but that's good clinical work. If you want to attach them, certainly you can. I don't do it. Anything else? Somebody has a good question here. They said, how would you manage an assessment of a person who has an extensive conviction background? Would you need to assess and document all the crimes individually in the evaluation? What I typically do is if somebody has one, I'll ask the individual to give me it. And if you have access to their criminal background, I would just list them. That's all I do is I list them, because the criminal background check says this is what the crimes were. You don't have to do any additional work. If you have barrier crimes that are screenable, those are the ones you need to focus on. And that's what I would address.
So someone said, how many requests for screening does the state get per year? We approximately, I'd say maybe 25, maybe. That's probably stretching it. But I think one reason because of that is there are probably a considerable amount of individuals out there that could possibly be meet everything, the criteria to be screened. It's just they don't know that, and there's no education going on per se.
Right.
So
yeah, I
agree. I think that's really an under amount, but as far as physically in my hand, knowing that someone is eligible to be screened and getting the screening done, I'd say, and that's including private providers and CSBs.
Yeah.
I don't have any way of knowing about the CSBs, but just based off of my 35 years of experience with the department, I'd suspect probably still, even including licensed private providers and CSBs, I'd say 25, and that's pushing it.
Yeah, and I think what the key here is that it's educating the folks who go through the peer process. I know that there were some people who hired individuals for employment who I probably would have not, I would have pushed for screening. I knew of an individual who was hired and had not done the 5 years. I know that for a fact, but they didn't come to me for an assessment. It was another CSB who decided to do that employment. That's their business. That's not mine. And they felt comfortable. It also depends on the position. I had an individual who, prior to them doing a screening, was working in a correctional setting, and they weren't required to do. They understood what the background was. They were operating as a peer in a correctional setting, but they weren't working for the CSB. So therefore, they could still do their peer work. They were a certified peer, but they hadn't gone through the screening process. So there are people out there who could be working for the CSB, I believe, that if they understood what the process was, and I think we're making it much more reasonable now. We're taking the law and making it more understandable and have a flow of the system so that we don't get into this, making it more complicated and necessary.
And there was another question, and then I'm going to piggyback off of what Joe was just talking about. Does the employer get the report? Yes. Typically, what's supposed to be done is that when the screening is done, the report is given to the employer as well as the individual. Now, I don't know if that's exactly how Joe and Peggy are doing it, but that's how the code is written.
Typically, what I do is I give a copy to the person that I screen and tell them to give it to their employer. And there's no question about releases or whatever. They can distribute it to whomever they wish.
Okay, and so also based on what Joe was just talking about as far as corrections, and a lot of people probably don't realize this, and so I always try to educate whenever I get a chance. Virginia is a very contradictory state. And when I say that, I mean that they will give someone their rights back to vote, carry hold a public office, or be a notary if they were convicted of a felony, and also if they meet whatever criteria you have to meet to have your rights restored. Also, Department of Health Professions, Board of Counseling, Board of Dentistry, Board of Pharmacy, all of the boards except Board of Nursing, none of the other boards require a fingerprint background check to be completed and reviewed before an individual is issued their license to practice. And the Board of Nursing just started doing that, where they require applicants to receive, to sit for their boards or whatever, to undergo a fingerprint background check to be done and to be reviewed. And that just started in 2016. So you have a lot of misconception out here amongst the general public, as well as employers, that when someone comes and applies for a job for them and they note that they are a licensed clinical social worker, or a QMHP, or an LPN, well, not an LPN, but a licensed LPC, all of those those licensing certifications, people think that they've had a background check done. And
It's not.
so they're like, oh, okay, well, this is a license, she's got an LCSW, so I know she's fine. But then when they go to submit their background check and I tell them the individual's not licensed, well, then they're really confused, because then they're like, well, she's got a license as a clinical social worker. Why are you telling me that I can't hire her or keep her employed, but yet Virginia, y'all gave her a license? So just like with corrections doesn't have the same barriers as DBHDS.
Yeah.
But they're working over there, but they can't work here.
Right. Yeah, that's why I used the example. The first one that I did was an individual who was working as a mental health professional in corrections, but had a barrier crime that had to be screened whenever they came to the CSB. I think that's important. I also had a recent one where a young woman had contacted me for screening because she wanted to be employed in the CSB setting, but she was a nurse and she could be employed anywhere in Virginia as a nurse, but not in the CSBs or licensed facilities by DBHDS. So it's a little weird. There's a question here about HR. I know we have a couple HR people. If the individual who asked the question about HR departments being more aware of the screening process, we have offered to provide this training at a VSCSB conference sometime in the future. Maybe the training conference if we wanted to. We now have a HR council at VACSB. So if you belong to that council or are interested, we certainly would be able to provide that information there as well.
Yes.
I think questions that arise like the having to have an offer of employment is really important, because to me, that's, if we had to change one thing, I'd want to change that, because we want to do as many screenings as we possibly can. Screen people, get them ready for employment, and get them out there. I think every peer training, peer certification training that we do, we need to talk about barrier crimes early on and tell them that if you have a potential barrier crime, we need to get, and you are looking for employment, let's see if we can get you a conditional offer somewhere so that we could do that assessment.
Yes.
That would be helpful. So let me see if there's anything else here. This is a question from Judy Jacob. After the person's screen completes a successful screening, does a person or agency provide the report to the BIU to become an eligible status BIU report? That's you.
Yeah. Are you meaning as far as if the screening is done one time and then the report is rendered and that they are okay to work at that provider or that CSB, are you saying then that we be able to note it somewhere to where if that person applies for a job again, then they would maintain eligible status? No. And the reason I say that is because between the time that the person was, if we were to say that that person could have eligible status, caveat throughout, and let me know if I'm not understanding your question. But if this person that was screened today, and we said, yes, they can be screened and they can be eligible to work, then a year down the road, they decide that they're going for a promotion at another provider, and they go to work there and they say, hey, I've got this, my screening report saying that I'm okay. That means you don't have to do a background check. Then the answer would be no, because we have no way of knowing what happened from today to next year when they apply and get hired or get an offer of employment for the job. They could have committed some other barrier and been convicted of it. And if we did not do a background check on them, we would have no way of knowing that.
Right.
Now,
I think
if
the answer,
they,
yeah, you and
if
I would
they,
say the same thing. I think that my only thing was, I thought the question was oriented towards a screenable crime. Would they have to have another an assessment? No. The only thing they'd have is the barrier crime. I
yes,
mean, the criminal background check. You got to do a criminal background check regardless.
yes, that is correct. And if the only thing they had was the screenable that came up, then no, you would not have to do another screening. Like Joe just said, that screening that was done, the report could be used for whatever other employer you had. Barrier crimes are being discussed in the PRS 72-hour trainings. Joe, do you
Yes.
know what that
Yeah,
is?
that's the peer services training. Yeah, they are. They should be. I every time we have one, I always say make sure we talk about this. But I think the training curriculum has a. That's a Mark Blackwell question. Mark probably can answer that one. I don't have an answer for that, but I believe it is. We've said that every time we've done any type of training in our committee. We said, please let people know that we don't want to waste their time. You know, we don't want to train somebody up for a peer position if they're not going to be working in the CSB system. That doesn't mean they can't work in another system. They may be able to work in a correctional setting. But if they're licensed by the Department of Behavioral Health, they have to have, they can't have a barrier crime.
I'm gonna step away just for one quick second. I'll be right back, Joe.
Okay. Absolutely not. If you're a contract worker, you're still, you have to have a criminal background. At least in our CSB, you do. You know, we do our docs. You know, we have folks who do telemedicine for us, and we make sure they have criminal background checks as well. So the answer from my perspective is no, you can't get around it. There's no working around that. Plus, think about it from a perspective of being, if that person does something untoward and you didn't do a criminal background check, you know, you're hanging yourself out there. So I certainly would not want to do that or be that person. You know, I'm not an attorney, but I certainly would not put myself at risk by hiring somebody without a criminal background check. So what else we have? That was a good question. All right. Can someone be screened after they're employed? Yes, and that does happen sometimes that, you know, a person is offered employment. I don't know of anybody that doesn't do a conditional employment. You know, every chances of having everything done. I just hired a medical director and we were having trouble getting fingerprint reading on her. And any employment is conditional. And unless a person meets all the criteria, you could do that. That's at the comfort level of whether or not you can bring somebody on board. I think in my experience, again, this is Joe's experience at Chesapeake, we have brought people on when the criminal background check has not been received yet, but we don't allow them to work with individuals face-to-face without supervision. And that goes for everybody. So good question.
Okay, now was this the question where can someone be screened after they are employed?
Well, I think everybody's, yeah, I've done that before. We've had people employed and they get that criminal background check and they go, oh my God, there's a barrier crime.
Yeah.
And it's a screenable one. Yeah, of course you can, but the person
Yeah.
can't be allowed to work. At least I was just sharing my experience. We don't allow people to work face-to-face with clients until the background check comes back.
Right. Now, also, Cindy, in answer to your question, the contract workers, if they are entering into, well, as far as the CSBs, the contractors, I believe all CSBs consider contract employees as normal workforce, meaning they are considered an employee, so they're going to be held accountable or held to the same standards as a regular employee. But private providers, it's based off of how their policies are written, because the law, the burial crime law, is not specific in saying contractors, volunteers, students, and interns. It only says hired for compensated employment in a direct care position or supervising a direct care position. So I know of some private providers that have used that contract status as a loophole in order to get someone there to work with them that they know positively has a burial crime conviction. And because the regulations only state that the provider has to have a policy talking, and I talked about this earlier, where they have to have a policy talking, referencing all individuals in their business. And at a minimum, they have the disclosure statement. Now, I will tell you this, that there is a Senate, I don't know if it's a Senate bill or a House bill out there for this session where they are requesting that contractors be added in the code section. So then it will read contractors and hired for compensated employment as an employee as added language in the code section. So then that loophole cannot be used. Now you also said, huh?
Now, when you're out, I tried to answer the question. If you're a contract worker, I'm not getting around the burial crimes issue. My advice was, and this is Joe, and speaking from a locality, we don't hire anybody and put anybody in work unless we have a criminal background check. And I don't ever want to be in a situation to be the executive director in the news saying, "Oh, gee, I didn't do that because he was a contract worker." Not happening. Right. Not happening.
Yes, better to err on the side of caution, and that's what I tell all of my providers that I do the background checks for. But you know, you have sisters and brothers and aunts and uncles and, you know, everybody wanting a job. So that's where I have seen it come to fruition, where they use that contractor as a loophole.
Yep. I don't feel comfortable. Private providers may feel comfortable doing it, but I don't. As a public provider, I can't do that. I don't want to be in the newspaper.
Did you see, Joe, the question, where could we find information on vendor compensation rate for completing assessments?
Yeah, I did. I said that before. There is no information for compensation for completing assessment. I base it on what it costs us to provide the services. And I would assume every CSB will do that. I said that mine is about $250 with including the, it's probably $236, I think is what last time I did it, which is, you know, it's less than what it costs us for an intake. And I try to require that the individual provide me with as much information as I can so that I can basically review it and put it in the report without having to ask a bunch of questions. We're only seeking clarification. So I try to cut my time down as much as possible to do that. So no, there is no consistency, because actually just Peggy and I have been doing them. So that's how I've been doing them. So if you want to charge $1,000 to do this, go ahead. You won't have any business. Yeah, nobody's going to make money off of this. Let's put it out there. This is right. This is helping peers to become employees. That's my thoughts.
It looks like HR, after the criminal report is received, would be responsible for telling the applicant a screening is necessary. Yes. Most applicants who are coming in on a peer, you know, as a peer type position should already be aware of what their criminal history is and that they have possibly a screenable. But, you know, I know there are some that don't. So that's why really you ought to know this even before you receive the criminal report. And the reason being, I try to stress as as much as I can, as far as coming from an HR background, you should be looking at that disclosure statement and questioning that individual about their disclosure statement before you even get that criminal report. So if someone is truthful and wants a job and doesn't have anything to hide, then they're going to check, yes, they've been convicted of whatever crime on their disclosure statement. And if they're not very forthcoming in the information, then you need to ask them the questions as far as to try and ensure that they meet the criteria pertaining to the screening. And before you waste the money on conducting the background check, because let's just say somebody puts on their disclosure statement that they were found guilty of possession with the intent to distribute 3 years ago. Well, you shouldn't even proceed with any hiring because their disclosure statement has told you everything you need. It was 3 years ago. It doesn't meet the 5 years. Therefore, they're going to be not eligible to be hired or to stay employed. That's what another reason why in my slides that I did, I said, make sure that your application, if you ask any type of a criminal history question on your application for employment, that it matches your disclosure statement. Now, I do know that we've got the ban the box thing, and I do know that some CSBs, maybe all of them, put into effect that when it was passed, I believe, maybe not all, but of course I know the state agencies did. So I don't think, maybe some applications don't even have that, but if it does, then that disclosure statement, the question needs to match whatever's on the application. And then it needs to be reviewed thoroughly because it can save you and that individual a lot of time. Now, if that person discloses that they were found guilty of that possession with the intent to distribute 10 years ago, then you should be having that conversation about the screening based off of that disclosure statement before you even get the criminal history record.
Yeah, Melinda, one of the things that Kathleen Benavides put a question on before, I think we partially answered it before, asking about the low number of people asking for screening can be attributed to the fact that they need a job offer as a condition of screening. Yes, I think that does make it's a little crazy. You think employers are unwilling, have a lack of willingness to go through this process that's hindering individuals from moving forward with their career goals? Yes, that's true. I mean, as you know, I'll answer this from a perspective. If I can get a peer that doesn't have to go through the screening process and I need a position filled right away, who do you think I'm going to choose? I'm going to choose the person I can get through. What I think we need to do is to seek an opportunity to be able to do screenings independent of job offers.
Yeah,
but you get into some crazy things like, how does a person get a criminal background check if they're not employed? So, I mean, you get sort of a catch-22 here. You have to get the job before you can get the screening, but you can't get the screening until you get the job. So, I think we'll be working on that as the future goes on, because we want to make sure as many peers we can hire that are appropriate get hired. So
yes.
So I appreciate that question. I mean, we're peer advocates here. I mean, that's my position. We want to advocate for as many people with lived experience to get in the field as we can. Okay. Anything else? We're getting on to 5 minutes to 12 and we were scheduled to 12. Is there anything else we can do? Can you get the screening independently without a job offer? The answer is no. Because, I always say that if you have a problem with it, get a conditional job offer. If you get the screening and everything's okay, we'll do that, because that gets the ball rolling. If you don't get the job, so what? At least you have the conditional offer, and if they have to fill it, at least you have your screening done. Anything else for the good of the order? if somebody has a barrier crime that has a specific time limit and they have passed the time limit, for example, 10 years, do they still need to go through the screening process?
No.
Yes, they do.
Oh,
Yeah, they do. I mean, just because it's been 10 years since you had an assault on a police officer or an assault on a family member, you still have to go through the screening process.
yes, yes, yes. It's only like felony possession of drugs. Well, no, because that's 5 years. And so, no, never mind. Yes, I misheard the question. You're right, Joe.
The question, yeah, that's okay. That's why we have two people doing this. The question is always about, do you have to do the screening process? Yes, you have to do the screening process. Okay. What we'll do is we will consult with Gabrielle and figure out how we want to send out this information. She's been gathering all the email addresses for people who would like the information. We'll also have Melinda get a clean copy of any of the forms that we have, and we'll try to send this out as a packet if we can, so that you'll get the screening information, the PowerPoint that Melinda did, the PowerPoint I did, my 2 sample evaluations, a copy of the screening form that she mentions, and a copy of the application that we have there, and we'll get that out as soon as we can. Anything else, Melinda, that you have?
No, the only other thing is there was one last question. How long will the screening last or be good? If you're talking about the report, meaning once the screening is done, it follows you. So if you got it while you were working or getting ready to work at Chesapeake CSB, and 2 years later you get a job at Newport News CSB, you can utilize that same report. You just need to make sure that they are aware of it when you apply and are hired for the job at Newport News, and that you make sure you disclose whatever the conviction is on that disclosure form.
Right.
But other than that, I'm fine, Joe. Nothing else.
That's good. The other thing I'd like to do too is, if I can, I mentioned it there, I'm going to look around and see if I can come up. Maybe Gabrielle has a brief feedback on the presentation. So if we need to change anything that'd be more helpful, that would be good. I've gone through Melinda's presentation a couple of times. I think she does a comprehensive job with what she does. And I'm a clinician, so I'm always open to help me fix it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I can't think of everything, man. And there's a lot better clinicians out there than me. So I'm always willing to learn. So if there's anything you think we need to change, let us know. So with that, I think it is now 12 o'clock and we're finished. So thank you all very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. See ya.
Bye.
Hey, Gabrielle.